He recently received his PhD in creative writing in Queen's University, Belfast. Close to Home is his first novel, right here, beautiful cover. Turn it upside down. And it's celebrating its US release today. So congratulations, Michael. Thank you for being here. As well as being one of the best humans on the planet, Caoilinn Hughes is a wonderful writer and book citizen. Her most recent novel, The Wild Laughter, won the 2021 Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award, was short and long listed for a number of other very prestigious awards, and is an Exile favorite. In recent and very exciting news, do you mind if I say this, Caoilinn? Caoilinn received a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, which starts in September of this year and will run through the publication of her new, highly anticipated novel, The Alternatives, in the spring of 2024. That is very exciting news, and we hope that means that we can finally meet Caoilinn in person stateside. Before we get started, I would ask those of you tuning in this afternoon to please mute yourselves, but keep your cameras on so that our guests don't feel like they're speaking into a void. You can type any questions you might have into the chat, and Caoilinn will ask them of Michael around the 45-minute mark. You can purchase signed copies of Close to Home and Wild Laughter through our website, and the link in the chat, or go to exilebookbill.com. We ship throughout the US. We are also very proud to partner with No Alibis bookstore in Belfast for this event. You can get signed copies from No Alibis through the link in the chat as well. Before I step away, please help me in welcoming Michael Magee and Caoilinn Hughes. Please enjoy the show.
Thank you, Javier. Thanks so much. Lovely to see some of your faces and to see a few of you here, and this will go online afterwards, but it's always just really lovely to have people in the moment, and you know, there's such an abundance of stuff online. In the end, the hypothetical of getting around to it, I don't know, loses some of the magic. So thank you for turning up. And Michael, we know one another a bit from Belfast, so that's so just as well I missed the 15-minute warm-up session behind the scenes getting to know you.
And all we did was talk about you, and I was going, I've actually known Caoilinn for a very long time when you think about it, like, but we sort of like cross paths every once in a while. You'll just appear like in a shroud of mist, and then that would be it, like, wouldn't it? I mean, that's the
as I want to do. No, I'll talk a little bit about my perception of Belfast and when I was there, and then when we overlapped, which I think actually was when you returned. You weren't there when I was there, but just because there's actually a couple of little readings I'd love you to do in this hour, and the reason for this, folks, is because the book Close to Home, which is just, I can't recommend highly enough. It's so open and generous and kind of one of a kind. It's so natural and relaxed, and yet kind of about very profound, you know, worthy things, very normal people, and yet very particular lives. So it's such a gorgeous book, but the most kind of obvious thing to say about it is that the voice is utterly distinctive, and it really is such a clear Belfast voice, and to get that on the page is really hard, and so it's one of those books that will work really well as an audiobook, but obviously after you've purchased the physical copy, because I will say I've done both. I read it on the page first, then I listened to the audiobook, and then I reread it, and it does land differently when you hear it, but just right now I think it'd be lovely to just hear a little section from Michael, if you'd oblige.
Grant, yeah. Shout out to Conor McNeil, who did the audiobook. He did an amazing job. Guy from West Belfast and a brilliant actor. I'll just start from the start. One thing I'll sort of flag up is that the Peelers are the police for our American friends, named so after Robert Peel, who's famous for being the kind of guy, former Prime Minister in Great Britain, or whatever you want to call it, who was the guy who sort of set up what we now know as the modern police force. And Land Rovers are armored cars that the police drive here. Okay, so I'll just read the first few pages and we'll go from there. Part 1, Psalm 71, verse 1. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion. There was nothing to it. I swung and hit him, and he dropped. A girl came flying forward and pushed me. What'd you do that for? The lad was lying there, and I was standing over him, and there were people all around me making noise. By the time I got away from the tussle, 2 Land Rovers had pulled up. A jaded-looking peeler with a receding hairline came towards me. Is that blood? He said, pointing to a stain on my shirt that could have been anything. He took my name and number and told me he would be in touch. I held my hands up and said that was no problem. The lad came at me, I said. I didn't know what to do. At the top of the street, the lad was put on a stretcher, and the stretcher was heaved into the back of an ambulance. I think it's best you make your way home, the peeler said. I decided he was a good peeler, a helpful peeler. We'll be in touch, he said, and I thanked him. Thanks very much, I said. Back at the flat, Ryan had his phone in his face and was pacing up and down the living room looking for a party, but it was 5 o'clock in the morning and the birds were out. He pulled the blinds closed as if that would help and nearly took the window with him, the brightness. I grabbed the purple throw my ma had given us as a moving in present and pulled it over my head. I lay with my head on the pillow and stared through the space between the empty bottles. Ryan checked the fridge, the cupboard next to the fridge. He lifted a can from the counter and gave it a shake. I give up, I said. Give up? I haven't done fuck all. I'm going to bed. For fuck's sake, Sean, don't leave me hanging here. I'm not leaving you anywhere. I'm in the next room. Bounce into my bed, sure. We'll watch a film. We need to stop doing this. Doing what? Come on. The window above the bed was open and the breeze wafted through. I stripped down to my boxers and climbed under the covers, but stayed on the outside so I could creep into my own bed as soon as Ryan passed out. The wall was black with mold and it made the room smell damp. There were clothes all over the place, takeaway cartons, cups and glasses and empty cans. Ryan smoked too much weed, that's what it was. It made him lazy, it made him not give up Alex. I said to him, you smoke too much of that shit. I took the spliff off him. He didn't care. He was thinking I did nicely. And he had his favourite film on, The Shawshank Redemption. He made me watch it every time we ended up like this. It gave him hope. Watch this, he said. It was that scene he loved, the one where Andy Dufresne arrives at the penitentiary and all the inmates are going mad, screaming at him, calling him and the rest of the newcomers fresh fish. I didn't think much of Andy the first time I laid eyes on him. That was Ryan's favourite line. He thought it was brilliant. I did too. Never judge a book by its cover. That's what that means. Never judge anybody, because you never know. The next morning, or later that morning, whatever way you want to put it, somebody was at the door. I rolled onto my side and tried to go back to sleep, but Ryan was up. He was shaking me, and he was like, that doesn't sound good. I sat up on the edge of the bed. It was better to do these things in stages, and watched Ryan lean with his ear against the door. Sounds like there's a few of them, he said. Men? Aye, men. I looked out the window and saw a car parked up at the front of the block. The driver's side door was open. I heard a radio, not the kind that played music, the other one. It's not the Peelers, Ryan said. How do you know? Because they would have shouted. They always shout. The knocking stopped. Footsteps echoed out the hall and were gone. The living room was a state. There were fag butts everywhere, spilled drink. Some dirty bastard had been flicking ice and the bottle caps had fallen on the floor. I brushed and mopped and got rid of the empties. Then I sat for a minute and looked out the window. We had a good view. The flat was on the 4th floor, so you could see right over the rooftops, the Casement Park, and the mountain. You can't miss the mountain. It's everywhere you go, every street and road in West Belfast. You can't get away from it. Whoever's writing those messages up there knows fine rightly as well. They couldn't have picked a better spot. Today, it was a massive tricolour, and underneath it, they had written the words "End Internment." Who do you think it was? Rand said. Dunno. Dissonance? Why would dissonance be calling here? I thought you meant the mountain. Rand looked out the window. That's not dissonance, you rocket. Who is it then? Fuck knows, could be anyone, he said. Then he clapped his hands. It's the Illuminati. The Illuminati have infiltrated the Ra. He opened the fridge and stared at the empty shelves. The acne on his back was getting worse. The pimples had gone purple and bubbled under his skin. 6 months in the gym will do that. And the steroids he made me inject into his arse cheek every other day. You could see it in his face, the puffiness, the jacked up redness around his neck and shoulders. We need food, he said. Have you cash? The fuck, spunked everything last night. Aye, me too. I boiled the kettle and brought it with me into the bathroom, filled the sink with hot water and topped it up with cold. The boiler was broke. There was no heat in the radiators, no hot water, and it wasn't like we could phone the landlord and ask him to sort it out. He went bankrupt and did a runner to Spain, leaving it with properties to be repossessed. That's why we didn't answer the door that morning. It could have been someone looking to turf us out. I started on my hair, giving it a good go with shampoo. I used a cup to rinse the suds and got to splashing my balls and torso. Then I sat on the edge of the bath and looked at my hand. The knuckles weren't swollen and my fingers were all intact. I made a fist and stared at it, then at my arm right up the shoulder, where the thin lines of my tribal tattoo were so black they looked blue. I need to get out of this, I thought. I didn't know what this was. Cheers. That's it.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so there's just so many linguistic things that I don't know whether American readers will take just pleasure in them as well. Like, I know fine rightly, and that is a phrase that just, I don't know, it's very rich to me. And there's little ways of kind of constructing simple intensification things that happen in Belfast English. There's these constant little kind of de-escalation strategies into the language.
Oh yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. I didn't think of that.
I was trying to figure out why I always feel so like people are always so kind in Belfast and so nice, and I always kind of go, whenever I go back, I think, am I going to be just a twat now, make a twat of myself, being very nostalgic about the place, and then I always come away just feeling like everyone had been really nice. And then I think I wonder, it was reading your book, looking at some of the language, and just it's built in, everything is kind of softened in a way that's really warm and like homely and friendly, but it also covers things, like it covers Sean, the protagonist's judgments about certain things, judgments about people around him. We get access to them also gently, I'll say. It's not like he's an embittered person, but we get access to them. We get access to the knowledge that he doesn't think highly of his mother's paintings, but we also simultaneously feel the admiration that she's making them. And it is something in that sensibility that comes through, the kind of kindness that's there somehow all the time.
It's very good at deflecting. That's kind of, you're sort of constantly pawing things. And, people always talk about the humor, the sort of the northern humor, the black humor. Mike Davis sort of touches on it when he talks about bringing his, Mike Davis, the sort of social theorist and Marxist, who used to bring his mates over. He lived in Belfast for some time. And anytime he would bring his big union boys over to Belfast, they would be horrified by how and think, why does nobody like us here? And Mike Davis says, it's not that they don't like you, they just like taking the piss out of you. And they'll do it with a smile, they'll sort of do it as if, we're good friends, but at the same time we'll sort of try and cut through you. And that sort of comes into it as well. But
very much so. one of the things, so I'll because there's so much to say, I just in terms of the setting of this novel. So I studied in Belfast between 2003 and 2007. And I had the time of my life there. I felt like I met my people for the first time ever. And so, yeah, I do have this kind of nostalgia about the place. And I've been back many times since. But one thing that I will say, and I kind of acknowledge, is that I probably was seeing Belfast at a time of unprecedented optimism, because it still was in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. There still was that the potential of kind of more investment, or at least the promise of it. And there was an upward trajectory in terms of infrastructure in the center of the city. Now that wasn't, as far as I know, dispersed very well to the communities surrounding the cathedral quarter and various places in the city center. But something about, the timing of this novel, there was a Kirkus review. I don't know if you read it, but I'm going to tell you now the last line. It was very positive. Michael, they said the last line was an impressive coming of age tale enriched by its bleak setting. Yeah. I just laughed reading that, because I thought, as opposed to an impressive coming of age tale let down by its bleak setting. But can you tell me about what, your decisions around what year to set this novel, and whether or not there was anything going on at the particular time that that's distinctive, as opposed to now? Yeah,
it's really interesting, because you left in 2007. I left in 2008 to go to my undergrad in Liverpool, and at that year the economic crash happened, the big one. And those 3 years I was in university, I was, of course, like kind of detached from it in some way. It didn't sort of affect me directly, other than because I was working in bars, in nightclubs and stuff like that. And so I was kind of cushioned and didn't really know what was going on. I think the Tories got elected in like 2009 as well. It's the beginning of austerity. And so when I came home, I returned to Belfast coincidentally around about the same time Sean did in 2011. And when I came back, I was kind of the only person out of my friendship group, certainly, and one of the few people in my broader family who went to university. All my mates were sort of working class boys who left school and went on to do trades, building trades, particularly when they were like 16. And so when I came, and they were sort of in their apprenticeships, and when you're an apprentice in a building trade, you do 3 to 4 years. And your wage is usually around about 50 quid a week. And you'd be doing you'd be working from 7, 8 o'clock in the morning to 6, 7 at night, every Monday to Friday. You get a wee 50 note in your pocket at the end of the week for 2 or 3 years. Usually goes up after every couple of years, but the whole thing about that though is your end goal. You're going to have a trade at the end of this. You may well get a van. You'll be able to work for yourself or work a part of a broader company. There will always be work. It's your trade's part of your identity and who you are. But when I came back, that had gone. The building and manufacturing trades got massively hit by the economic crash. And so I sort of returned in the same way Sean did, and was surrounded by people then whose lives had been completely upturned. And so a lot of people left and went to Australia. A lot of people stayed and sort of eked out a living behind a till, as it were. Other people found other ways to, found other outlets, I'd say, And so that was like a moment, and then that sort of carried on in different forms for the next 10 years. It's still kind of varying from year to year, but happens again. Now you've got the cost of living or whatever. That's now the new form of change in labor or whatever. But so that was at the front of my mind when I sat down to write it, that I kind of wanted to tell a story from the perspective of a sort of young university graduate who goes to university and sort of thinks that everything for him, the material conditions of his life, were going to change dramatically, that he was going to go get his degree and be like, right, life's, here we go, everything's sussed. And then he returns and realizes that actually there's nothing even for him or for the people around him. And so he falls back in with that group of friends who, in all sorts of ways, sort of look at him and think, well, what was that degree worth, and that sort of questions around who who you are and what you're doing at that particular moment sort of come into it, you know. And a lot of what Sean's doing or thinking about is trying to figure out a way of living, but it isn't that easy when all the sort of structures that all the social structures that structure your life are kind of making that very, very difficult for you in all sorts of ways, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Was, do you think the crash, was there anything in, you know, do you think that it was a universal story in Ireland, or that there was something distinctive in the north about? I was going back and forth between the Republic, or like the South, I was going back and forth between Galway, let's say, and Belfast frequently, and like there's a gap between me and my younger siblings, and like a big gap. And you know, so I really felt the Celtic Tiger, like, you know, the boom psychology, where, you know, you had a weekend and you'd be able to kind of think about going shopping with it or something like that. You know, like this was kind of a new way of living, which obviously had all sorts of its own complications. But it was such a rapid wealth, and I remember seeing the difference so starkly as soon as you crossed the border. And now you see it, you know, in other extremes, where like I was trying to charge an electric car in the north recently, and none of the chargers were working, and then there was a sign that said sponsored by the European Union, which obviously hasn't since Brexit. So
fucking Brexit.
So was there anything that you felt that you put into the novel in subtle ways that that had to do with the particular aspects of the crash in the north, or do you think that it was just such a universal, or even a UK wide, in terms of the way austerity was eked out there?
It's sort of like, because that's the thing, I'm only sort of gone off memory in a lot of this, like, and just like how, like, I remember the impact it had on the high street, you know, and the same impact that we sort of feel now around the cost of living, that the shops can't keep up with the rates and charges. So that's sort of, and then the sort of switch to like the service industry economy, which sort of started around about 20 years ago, but sort of hit its peak around then. And then there was also a massive shift around, because the north was a big center for manufacturing and trade, manufacturing place, and it still kind of is actually now, but it's shifted forms. And then so there was a huge, particularly after the crisis, the trades and building work sort of fucking disappeared, you know. It really did.
That would have been a big commonality, I think. I think in
between north and south, yeah, because a lot of my mates sort of went up and down, and you know, between, because in Dublin you would have made a lot of money on building trades, like, and even after the crisis you could still get more work, and there was still people I know that was going down maybe for a week or two and doing a bit of work here and there. But the kind of, it's funny because around that time, and even now, you would get like a lot of people who were tradies went into driving taxis, and so they would always talk. You know, you'd say that saying, you know, if you ever need a house built, bring a taxi driver. They usually have all the trades. It's the thing, like.
Wow, so you could write a book about taxi drivers, because you also have a really interesting section in this novel about what who makes up the taxi drivers.
Black taxi drivers, anyway. Yeah.
Maybe you could share that for the people present.
Because the black taxi, so there's a form of transport that sort of emerged in West Belfast in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. Basically what happened was that a lot of buses were being stolen and used as barricades in different districts in West Belfast, and using it as a mean of protection from whether it was usually from like loyalist mobs, but also from the Brits. So the Brits, but they would steal buses and use them as barricades. So the transport infrastructure up into the west of the city was suspended. It was cut off for a long time, that you couldn't get buses in and out of the town. So there was this sort of grassroots kind of movement happened around what people would call, was a name for it, the good neighbor policy, which was basically, because there were so few people in West Belfast that had cars at the time, that they would share their car to drive people in and out of the town, and they would charge like petrol money, you know. And then a couple of people who were like living within the community went to London and picked up some hackney cabs, the black taxis, and then used them. It's called the People's Taxis at first. and they would basically traverse up and down bus routes, up and down West Belfast, dropping people off and picking them up. And then that became the primary mode of transport infrastructure in West Belfast over the next 10 years or so. They were kind of used during the Troubles a lot. They were almost seen as a source of reassurance for, nationalist Catholic Republicans. If they were ever caught up in something that they didn't want to be, if they saw a black taxi, they knew that was a means of escape. But then also that was appropriated famously by the Shankill butchers, that they would drive black taxis up and down West Belfast and pick up innocent Catholics, put them in the back, take them away and mutilate them and kill them. So that it sort of has that history. And then sort of was a primary means of transport for a long time. And then in 1998, a couple of years after that, prisoners were released as part of the Good Friday Agreement, political prisoners, both loyalists and Republicans. And a lot of the Republicans who were released, you couldn't really get work in certain industries in certain places with your record. So that a lot of them went in and, either worked within their communities or indeed drove black taxis. So that was their kind of mode. And so Sean sort of traverses up and down West Belfast a couple of times anyway in black taxis. And they're strange because they still operate, a lot of them are doing tours now of West Belfast, which are actually pretty good tours, to be fair. But you would get in the back and there would be 4 other people in the back with you, and they would knock the window whenever they want to get out at any time. But it's an interesting history of them. They were targeted a lot during the Troubles as well. There was a lot of taxi drivers black taxi drivers were murdered during the Troubles, just because of the fact that they drove them. They knew that was a Catholic thing to do, so.
Yeah, there's just a couple of lines, in the novel, but it's just an indication of the type of ease with which very particular details of history are kind of informing the book. And I think that that's all handled really well. I think it's very accessible to somebody who doesn't really know the history particularly well. One thing that's, I think, recognizable to certainly anyone, I don't know, I think that somehow the world will either survive lad culture or it won't. Like lad culture, it just feel, the guys on the tube who are going to a football match in the UK who'll just like batter all of the ceilings and say and yell in your face, and like I got absolutely terrified by lad culture, and I very much saw it kind of growing up with brothers and with their kind of initiations or their coping strategies through it. And that's something that this book is very much looking at. And I might actually, if you don't mind, Michael, I'm going to just read a tiny little section. It's just 2 paragraphs, and this is I think self-explanatory, but the larger questions are thinking about what's sanctioned, I think, by the culture, and not specific to the North, and why these things are sanctioned. So I thought about how I had tricked everyone into thinking I was hard. I'm not going to do the accent.
That's all right. Don't worry about
it. That I could handle myself without ever having to throw a punch. I could wing battles like a champion, and I was always getting into trouble with the teachers. And that somehow translated into me being able to have a dig. That's how it worked in my school. Tell the teacher to shove his Bunsen burner up his hole and everyone thinks you can scrap like fuck. If kids started on me in the street, I would run into my house and hide. I would stare out my bedroom window and pray for them to go away. Sometimes they did. Other times my ma would hand me a hurley and tell me to get stuck into them. I didn't have it in me. My brothers saw this and did what they could to toughen me. They would trail me out onto the street and tell me to hit the kid I had to fight. And I would, because they were there and nobody had the balls to hit me back. But my brothers had fought their whole lives and were good at fighting. Yet there I was, the only one out of the 3 of us who was stupid enough to get caught. Did you start out the book thinking that you were that this is what a big theme of the book, kind of toxic masculinity and, the inescapability of it?
No, I didn't. I really didn't. At least, I didn't think in them terms. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
I don't think, and I think that's probably true of most writers, or at least, I don't know, some people actually do know what they're trying to address thematically or trying to like kind of get the theoretical sort of underpinning of their book sort of sussed. I didn't really. It took me, I sort of just went where I knew, and I was sort of being steered, of course, by Sean and by who he was, and also his kind of, you know, I sort of look at Sean as being like an earlier version of myself, but a different version of that earlier version, or a version that kind of went. He sort of does have a lot of echoes of me growing up and who I was and the fears that I had. And I kind of had to draw on them to sort of make him a person. But like, and that sort of stuff about him, he sort of fears violence, and he's very forward with that. He actually does talk a bit about that throughout the book, where he's always afraid of being hurt and afraid of, you know, he sort of has dreams about men coming into his bedroom and shooting him. And then and that's kind of a, you know, an indicator towards that sort of inherited trauma that he takes from his mother. But I think at that bit in particular, he's talking about life on the estate, you know, and how his mother almost assumes that role, his sort of patriarchal role. She's a single mother with 3 boys, so the rules of the game and the estate sort of mean that, particularly for young men, you kind of have to be tough, and you can't shy away from it, and you have to stand up for yourself, and she has to assert those values, and their son, or at least is forced to, just by the mere fact that there is nobody else to. And those are the overarching, he sort of has to go out and stuff ways worse is the that it'd be harder for him if he didn't. But I didn't. It's weird because a lot of the way I thought about writing this book was through a sociological lens, you know, or at least like late in, as I got into later stages. I wrote the book as part of my PhD, a creative writing PhD, and the critical component of that was about class and social mobility, and particularly like symbolic violence, and how a person who moves out of the social space that he's sort of used to feels when he moves into another one that he's unfamiliar with, you know. And so that was kind of at the front of my head when I was writing this, that Sean almost had to exist on the margins, that he was sort of at the point that we come into the book, that he sort of realized that the punch somewhere in the back of his head tells him that if he keeps going down the path he's going down, it's not going to turn out well for him. And he sort of sees it everywhere around him, you know, whether it's with his group of friends or with the people he remembers who maybe lost their lives to suicide, or people, his older brother, and sort of looks at him and where his life has taken him, and the self-destructiveness of their lives, that he sort of feels that something in his head is telling him, I need to get out of this. And then, but he doesn't quite know where to go. And then when he's introduced to this other world, this other sort of, you know, literary world, or the more middle class world that are attached to Queen's University, he's distrustful of it and uncomfortable with it. And so these were the kind of things, that discomfort, but also where that discomfort comes from. It was really like important for figuring out who he was. And that sort of, for me, came down to class. But you can't really talk about class without talking about masculinity, or patriarchal masculinity, and how that works within that overall framework, you know. But I think like so much of like writing the book, or writing any book, is just about trying to find the story, you know. And so all these kind of movements come from like constantly excavating and constantly trying to figure out what makes this person who he is. A lot of it also has to do with like I wanted people to actually worry about what would happen to Sean. You know, that was something that was in the back of my head, that you kind of wanted people to feel worried about him and where he was going, and if he was going to make it. It was the thing, you know.
Yeah.
I feel like anything could be pulled out from under him at any moment, you know.
And to not end up having his story feel like it's one of self-betrayal in on the class side of things, because you do feel there are sections earlier in the book with characters who come across as kind of caricatures, and then they become more human, but nonetheless, you know, it's hard to know. We're trying to read Sean as to whether or not he's kind of reconciling himself to more of a sense of being a performed version of himself, and whether that gap will ever, whether it will ever fully dissolve.
But and that like lad culture has everything to do with it as well. It's like the terrible influences on his decisions and how that sort of works, you know. Like there's another part later where there's this kind of culture of trying to make your mates sort of fuck up, ruin their lives essentially, you know. And they would do it through taking drugs. And that, you know, like say one of them has work the next day and they're trying to stay on the straight and narrow, and it's like, we need to get him out because it'd be really funny to lose his job, you know. And that's the kind of humor, and they get dragged in, and part of it is a performance, you know, that you sort of lean into it in a way, and then you sort of see yourself getting taken along bet.
Yeah.
And he's sort of taken a long bet, and but yet everybody in that who sort of fit into those roles don't like those roles, you know, but then yet they're performing them.
Right,
You know?
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's just brilliant to see it on the page because it's so recognizable, and it is a trap. I think, you know, it will be equipping for some young men who read the book. I think even just to have that kind of awareness that it's not just their own experience. There's so much to this. I'm just looking at time going by. If you folks have questions, type them into the chat now, because otherwise it'll whip by. And there's gorgeous stuff. I don't know that we'll have time for the second reading because there's too many things I want to ask you about, Michael. But one thing I just wanted to say is that there's a huge strength of this novel is the mother-son relationship as well, and the character of the mother. I don't even know if she's given a name in the book, because she's just referred to as Ma because it's first person. I just found that such a gift. Her character and her, you know, moral and you know, interpersonal kind of realism, the kind of codes that she's come up with to live by. It's all just so interesting and very authentic. But then maybe one last thing I'll kind of say on the character side is that there's characters in this book who've had things done to them. And there are also characters who've done things to others. And I think that's really an interesting, I think like this is kind of largely at play through the book. There's various moments that it comes up, both with Sean and his kind of mates back in the day, and then with kind of older people in the book. And I think that speaks to a larger kind of colonial legacy in Ireland of the shame of having been a survivor, like that dates back way before, but also very much through the famine. And you know, that shame I think is still in the DNA. Because if you did survive, it meant that you deprived your neighbor of mercy, effectively, in one way or another. So I think that's a really interesting to have given space to in the novel, to kind of acknowledge that without having it be feel performed. It just feels like it crops up in quite a natural way in the book.
Yeah.
The only thing that I might kind of ask about that is, you know, you don't need to say anything about that at all. It's just really a comment. But having a religious epigraph was an interesting choice. Is that in any way, I don't know, connected to those questions of morality? And
it is. It actually is. Well, because I got that epigraph. I was looking for a title for the book, and I couldn't find one, so I turned to the Bible, as people are wont to do. And weirdly, I think Ellen. No, it didn't. It wasn't that one. But I basically, or no, I was looking up the etymology of the word trial. I think it was, or to be put to trial. And I was in the OED for a while, and I came across that little sentence that and basically put to fusion means put to trial. In the King James Bible, that's the word.
oh, to confusion. Oh, right. So just to remind the attendees, it's in thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion.
Which is
Right, okay.
put to trial, but or at least like that's one of the interpretations of it. And I kept going back to it, and I think that was then, because it's sort of, I was in two minds about, I didn't really want to use epigraphs for the book itself. I don't know, epigraphs kind of annoy me these, I don't know, people, it's always Alan Carson and fucking, you know.
I had an Ayn Rand epigraph on my first book, and people took it in earnest. They thought that I was an Ayn Rand fan. So never again.
Get slaughtered. But no, it's I don't know, or I don't know, sometimes they just feel like a bit of a flex, and sometimes they do actually kind of make sense. But when I was trying to figure out the structure of what the book, which was one of the really difficult parts of writing it, was figuring out the structure of the form. The three-part structure sort of fell in quite naturally and quite late on. And I had that quote, and I thought it kind of works well, not as it, because there was a while where I was entertaining the idea of calling the book Put the Confusion. I was like, this isn't gonna work. But it's, when I put it on that page, the part one, it's sort of gave a sense of what I was trying to do in that first section, which was basically to put Sean at a point in his life where he's like not quite in the witness box yet, but that's where he's going, and then it sort of became the and then the second part has the Kieran Carson quote about the sleech and the muck, which ties nice with community service. The final one has the Krishna Horky falling down in the darkness one, which isn't as optimistic as it probably should be, but it sort of made sense to me at the time. And I think, strangely, because there isn't a lot of talk about religion or Catholicism in the book. He clearly comes from a Catholic background, but is estranged from that. Estranged from it. He doesn't practice. He doesn't pray. But when he works in the chapel, he feels some kind of calmness in him. It's anybody who does when they go into that space, But other than that, it's sort of just sat nicely for me. That's kind of the only way I can describe it whenever I put it there. And that kind of made sense.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. No, no, and I love that, and that's very enriching to know the other meaning of confusion, or at least one of the interpretations. I can really see how that would have resonated with you. There are a lot of books that kind of came to mind when reading this, although I don't think it's like any of them. But I wonder whether any of them kind of gave you artistic license to write in this way in terms of style. So I was thinking of James Kelman. I was thinking even of Roddy Doyle. And then a book that I really loved a couple of years ago by Derek Owazu, called That Reminds Me. And so it's a question of like whether or not there were books that kind of gave you license in terms of style, and then maybe just to give a little sense of how this book came about, because I know its story, but just it's interesting for people, I think, to hear.
It's strange because I'd read a lot of I'd read James Kelman a while ago, actually. Well, long before I read this book, I read a couple of his books and loved them. I think he's kind of an astonishing writer, one of the best we have. But I think whenever it came to writing the book, I kind of had to work through a lot of my own stuff in a way that I kind of had to, and I think a lot of it had to come out of a place of shame, that I had very particular ideas about what literary fiction was, and I wasn't sure that the story that I was going to tell or wanted to tell fitted within the remit of what literary fiction was. And of course, this falls down to also where I was at that point in my life. It was like starting PhD and the sort of institution that I was kind of vaguely uncomfortable in. I was thinking about class a lot. I was thinking about my own sort of class trajectory. And so there was this degree of like imposter syndrome that I felt, and that kind of leaked into my own work. And so I was like I was trying to write a novel, whatever that is, but I guess whenever I sat down and tried to write a novel, it didn't work. Came across as like quite forced, and I guess that I always have that feeling that whenever I'm trying to write, if I try too hard to write, it's never going to go well. That you almost have to let yourself go, and that's kind of where, and get out of your own way. And that's how the novel started. Was that a friend of mine, Tom Morris, who was the editor of the Sting and Fly at the time, he suggested I write a letter that sort of starts at any point in my life, and to just sort of go from there. And I did this as a kind of writing exercise. Basically, we had set up one night drinking and had one of them nights where friendships are made. You know, we sort of tell each other about our lives and sort of have a heart to heart and drink a lot more than what you sort of set out to. And he sort of had an idea of where I was sort of off the back of that, and sort of said, you know, maybe you should try this, and this will sort of trick yourself into thinking you're not writing a novel, just do something else. So I did. And the letter just sort of got longer and longer. And over the course of about 3 months, then I had like this manuscript of 60,000, 70,000 words, which then I had to print off and post to him almost as a way of like divulging all this information about myself and being rid of it, you know. But we both kind of knew after he read that highly confessional but vaguely narrative piece of writing that this was the thing, or at least the bones of something that I kind of needed to turn into something else. And I think that was, yeah, that was a really important kind of method. But little did I know that it would take me another 5 years on top of them 3 months to actually fucking finish the thing. But the seed was there, the embryo, and I sort of knew then that was what I needed to work through.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was sort of working through my own sort of stuff, you know, my own various issues, but also coming to terms with who I am and where I'm at this point in my life that allowed me then to write the book in a way, you know. And so then, and around that time, I was reading a lot of I was reading Annie Ernaux as part of my PhD, and Didier Erobon and Edouard Louis, these sort of French auto-fictional writers who are all dealing with sort of social mobility and class. And their sort of experience of class spoke very directly to my own. And that actually, more than anything, sort of allowed me to open up a bit. I think I was kind of reluctant also to read too much Irish fiction around that time. I don't know why, because I spent most of my early 20s reading a lot of it and then kind of disengaged from it. And I think I kind of needed to do that. I kind of needed to go elsewhere.
I
I don't know,
understand that. I
you know,
understand.
you kind
Yeah.
of had to like move away.
Mhm.
And I loved, like, I mean, I remember reading Al Enright and Colin Tabine and people like that, and just being absolutely mind blown, you know, by what they were able to do on a page. But I almost had felt I just have to get away. I have to go and see something else, and that was a big a big thing in terms of
A bit
writing.
of a license, yeah.
Yeah.
I just looked in the chat, and John Waters has said, who I believe is from NYU, has said, I think Sean's experience of being haunted by his living younger sister is brilliantly written. It's one of many aspects of the writing where things that might have gone wrong go very right.
Good question, John.
It's a compliment. Take it.
Thank you so much.
And Adeline Henry has said thanks very much, and she's enjoyed. She loved the read, excellent read, but she has to shoot off. So one thing I wanted to say also, I don't know how many folks here will know that Michael is an editor. I believe you're still the editor, the fiction editor of a literary journal called The Tangerine, which I would say, you know, is like if the Stinging Fly is the well-known magazine of Dublin, I think definitely The Tangerine is the magazine for the North, and it's kind of it's a much more recent magazine, but it's become very kind of a fast pillar, I think. And are you still working as an editor on that?
Yeah, I'm still at it. I've taken a little half step back, to be fair. I'm still involved, and I'll probably remain involved for the foreseeable. But no, that's like something we started that, like, it's interesting actually, because we started The Tangerine around about the same time I started writing the book, in like 2016. And we've done like 12, 13 issues now, published some brilliant work, and it's kind of a joy, or it was a joy. At least it gets a bit harder now. But when you've been doing it for so long, you know. But
it was the magazine that you know, was played a part in kind of discovering Louise Kennedy's voice in publishing one of her stories that was shortlisted for the Audible.
I take all the credit for that, actually. But
I know it's an absolute stunner of a story, and
which I remember her saying to me that and being like, "I've got this terrible story here. Would you have a look at it?" And I was like, "Aye, okay." Like, yeah.
On that note, maybe like there's and maybe this will be our last question. I just want to make sure that the links to get the book. So we've got links from Exile in Bookville to get close to home from any of the US people present. But if you're in Europe, there should be a link that should pop up at some point from No Alibis. But if it doesn't pop in the chat, you can just Google No Alibis and Close to Home, and they've got a link online. That's Michael's local bookstore, and a place if you ever go to Ireland you have to visit, because it's a really fantastic indie, and is a kind of enters the imagination, I think, in a very deep way of all of the writers who live there. But just on kind of writers that are having a moment from the north, Louise Kennedy is one of them. Another, obviously, Milkman, and I think Dairy Girls would have been, both kind of moments of huge sudden international attention toward the north. I know Lisa Magee, the writer of Dairy Girls, spells her surname differently. You're not related, are you?
Oh, no, we're not. But I wish it was. She seems great. But yeah. I think she's got a lot to do with the fact that people are actually interested in reading about this place, as much as Milkman. But I think Lisa Magee has something to do with it.
Yeah, and the culture in Derry is different as well to the culture in Belfast. So it's you need more than one story. So it would seem. I'm watching a TV show called Blue Lights. Have you seen that? It's a police procedural, which is not normally what I watch.
Oh, I've seen it. Don't you worry. I'm like yeah.
You have seen it?
I have seen it. Yeah. What do you think?
I know a bunch of the actors in it from back in the day from Queens. So
tell them I'm coming for all of them.
Oh, really? Well,
I think it is a very good police procedural, but it does that brilliant thing of we have to sympathize with the police, and all the people who live in the working class estates. The basic, actually, it's interesting because a lot of the places where the footage is shot in Blue Lights is shot in places where Sean moves through. Actually, the chapel he works in is shot in the estate where Blue Lights is set in. But all the people who live in that estate are barbarians, But that's
right. Very, very good point. And one thing there are many questions I didn't ask you from my list of over prepared questions, and one of them was about the fact that you don't name any of the peelers in the book, and they don't even get individuated at any point. There's no descriptions or anything, and I am imagining that you didn't even have to make that choice consciously, that it was just the default, so that there is a lot of controversy still over the police in Northern Ireland, and I can that's a very good point to make, that the show is doing a big kind of service, maybe where it's maybe not due.
Oh, it's done a great service for the PSNI. Like, I mean, it's a big fucking slap of propaganda, I think, but it has its moments. It does have its moments, but like, yeah, I plan on I want to write.
So yeah, that there's me outing my naivety. Now that you say it, it's completely obvious.
But the thing is, that's why The Wire is so good. Do you know what I mean? It's almost the opposite to what Blue Lights does, but
yeah. Brilliant. Listen, I could talk to you all day, and people have given up their lunch hours. So thank you so much, folks in attendance. And I think Javier is going to pop back on for some more housekeeping.
Thanks so much.
And thank you so much to Exile in Bookville and No Alibis.
Yes, thank you, No Alibis, for partnering with us on this this event. You can purchase both. We have signed book plates for both of these. We will have them for Michael's book. Thank you all for coming, everyone for coming, showing up today, and thank you, of course, Michael, for tuning in, and Caoilinn for always being just so prepared. You don't over prepare. You prepare enough. you always come with great questions, and you make everyone feel comfortable, and I love hearing the conversation between you two as I was working. So thank you all. If you guys could both just stick around for a few seconds after,
of course.
After we do everybody out. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. Cheers. I was drinking a whiskey there while I was doing this.
You were.
I poured myself like
awesome.
quite a large measure. You know, like it was like a celebration. I'll like, you know, and that, like half an hour in there, I was like, I feel